Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for our webinar titled How Hong Kong's Insurers Are Protecting Its Users from Cyber Threat. Special thanks to the speakers for taking the time to share their views with us and F5 for sponsoring this webinar. Today's topic is an important one, especially when you consider the fact that Hong Kong cybercrime has gone up by sixfold, with monetary losses nearing 3 billion Hong Kong dollars. You couple that with the fact that cybercriminals are increasingly eyeing insurers for their valuable data. Today's conversation is very timely. Joining us, we have Chau, who is the CEO of Hong Kong's first virtual insurer, Blue. He's at the bottom of the screen there. And above him is Simon Chandran, who is the Financial Services Technology Consulting Leader at EY. And above Charles, we have Yiing, who is the Director of Data Science at Cybersecurity. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Pleasure.
Hi.
So maybe we can begin by taking a broad look at the state of things. I'd like to perhaps invite Simon to give us a sense of the threat landscape for insurers in Hong Kong, and then maybe we can go to Mark, and then we can go to Charles. Simon, you have the floor.
Well, first of all, thank you, Vincent. And obviously, I'm very happy to be here with my esteemed colleagues, Mark and Charles. So I think to answer this question, the way I would like to approach it is, I think there are largely two key aspects that contribute to the evolving threat landscape, particularly for insurers in Hong Kong. The first I would like to probably point out is that there are trends. And I think it's interesting to see what sort of trends do we see in this particular sector. For instance, we see that more and more insurers are largely leveraging, emerging technologies such as cloud to digitize their businesses, improve customer experience or journeys. And so what we find is that emerging technologies tends to introduce new cyber risks, which insurers will need to mitigate and manage. It was interesting for me personally to actually read one of the recent lab report from McAfee where, Hong Kong was probably one of the top 10 locations ranked globally suffering from external attacks on cloud accounts. So I think that's important trend. Number two is the fact that COVID-19, right? We're all living this today. But at an organizational level, it's definitely opened up a lot of disruptive opportunities for threat actors, essentially to step up their attacks. And we're seeing this, EY runs a global information security survey every year. And what we see from our respondents across the insurance sector as well is significant increases in the types of phishing attack, the sophistication of malware attacks and ransomware as well. So I think there are the threat landscape specifically for insurers in Hong Kong is largely driven by some of the trends that we see within the sector, and it's opening up more opportunities, more risks rather. And also I think the pandemic is introducing more opportunities for attackers as well.
Thank you for that, Simon. Now we move on to Mark. Mark, can you share with us your sense of the threat landscape for insurers in Hong Kong at the moment?
Sure, for sure. Thank you, and thanks, Simon. I think just to touch on a couple of points that Simon mentioned. Insurers, both traditional insurers, are kind of getting more digital. More and more functions are going digital. Everything from getting rate quotes to accessing accounts online to performing the sort of actions that you normally would use to go to an insurance agent for. And as far as totally digital insurers like Blue are kind of riding the wave and pioneering the way for everything digital first, right? To provide a much more sort of seamless experience for the user. And this is great, of course, for users. But in terms of threats, I think this just increases the sort of threat surface that insurers would face, right? So I would say that there are two primary types of threats. One is threats against the user. So in cases where you have things like account takeovers, where people either use bots or whatever else to access the account, and of course, obviously, in an insurance account, there are lots of very useful information, right? Personal information, maybe health, medical records, potentially how much you're insured for, how much you're worth in that sense. All those would be helpful, for use like future phishing attacks, for example, right? Or just information for sale. And then there are also threats against the business itself, the insurance business. So, a common thing that we hear from many of our insurance customers that we protect is even fake account creation. So, where lots and lots of accounts are created, perhaps with like stolen or sort of fake identities, and the company tries to follow up, like, hey, you created an account with us, like, would you like to finish your sign up, right? And this obviously costs a lot of operations and resources. As well as scraping is something else that we see as well in terms of threats. So both in terms of rate scraping, where somebody tries to use a bot to pretend to get all possible combinations of insurance quotes and prices, right? By pretending to be all age groups and all industries and smoking, non-smoking, everything that you see that basically can help competitors figure out your rate curves, your costs as well. Even your networks of doctors and then agents too. And finally, I think just an interesting observation is financial aggregators are also getting into this space. So there are services I think sort of pioneered in the US where we see people offering services where you can basically log in, provide your credentials to your digital insurance account, and the service will basically pretend to be you, use a bot, get access to your account, figure out how much you're paying, what sort of protection you have, help you cross-shop across 10 other insurers, and try to help you cancel your quote and move on. So those are some of the sort of interesting threats that we see lately.
That's really interesting because when you think about all these threats, you don't often consider scraping and the fact that other competitors might use it for a competitive advantage. So that's an interesting viewpoint. So as what Mark was saying, right? Charles, he runs a virtual insurer. It's fully digital, so I would imagine security would be a very important priority for a company like Blue. So Charles, why don't you walk us through from your perspective, what are you seeing in the threat landscape?
Sure. Well, first of all, I do agree with Matt and also Simon's comments. I think maybe a little bit of context as well. I think insurance company normally is a good target for cyber criminals, right? Because insurance company carries a lot of personal data, medical data, and also a lot of payment information as well. At the end of the day, I think these are very advantageous to criminals who can benefit from a lot of those information. So a good target for those guys. And I think people touch on COVID, also touch on just generally there's an acceleration of digital transformation for insurance companies in general. I think the pandemic has actually accelerated that. So you're seeing many insurance companies modernizing their operations with technologies, with big data, with cloud, with online services, even remote working. Inevitably, you're spending a lot more time online. Both the internal company, the customers, everybody in terms of engagement with the organization is going to be inevitably having a lot more touch point through the online services. So this has increased, I think, the threats such as data breaches, email scams, unauthorized access. I think inevitably the cybercrime has increased. I think many of us probably have read the news that I think one of our colleagues, players, insurers, has been a target and has seen some impact, very big impact as well. So I think it's critical for insurers, like not just digital players. Right? Certainly for digital players, we need to be triple conscious and careful. But in general, I think it's important for insurers to have a clear framework and strategies in place to really protect the company and the customers.
Certainly, it's definitely a priority for not just digital insurers, but also the conventional insurers as well. Now, Charles, while I still have you, I wanted to seek your comment on a general kind of perception that the industry has, right? So if you read multiple reports about cybersecurity in the financial services space, many reports point to the threat actors moving the target towards insurers because banks are spending more money versus insurers in cybersecurity. In your observation, is that true in Hong Kong, and why do you think that's the case?
I'm not too sure I agree to that. I think in terms of spending, I think the financial industry in general has a deeper concern, and I'll be very honest, and also have a deeper pocket as well in terms of spending in those areas. So in terms of the eagerness or the interest to spend and protect, I think we are all there. But in terms of the technology, I would argue that I think yes, indeed, it's true, because I think the insurance industry, for a lot of historical reasons, from a technology perspective, is actually quite behind. From a technology perspective, there's a lot of legacy systems. I think from that perspective, I think the banking side tend to be a little bit more advanced, and therefore, I think as they deploy protections and tools, they tend to be a lot more advanced, because when you have legacy systems, some of the gaps that you want to fill is a lot more difficult. So I will argue, I think from a interest and also eagerness to protect, I think we're both there. But in terms of technology maturity, I think in terms of investing in technology, I think the insurance company has a bit of catch up to do.
I would think so, right? I mean, at the core of insurance business, it is to protect, right? So it seems in line with the philosophy of the insurance industry.
Absolutely.
Right. Thanks for your views, Charles. Before I move on to the next question,
Vincent, apologies to interrupt, but I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
my goodness, we all fall victim to this whole mute thing. My apologies. Anyways, as I was saying, if anyone wants to add to the conversation about insurers perhaps spending less on technology and cybersecurity, feel free to unmute their mic. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. Does anyone want to add? No, all right. So I think earlier Mark, Simon, Charles all kind of pointed out, the type of data that the threat actors are interested in. And one interesting trend that we are kind of seeing is that there are threat actors out there who are targeting the general insurers who provide the cybersecurity insurance, right? And the reason why they're doing that is because they know that these companies will pay the ransomware to actually release whatever it is. So, those are some of the interesting trends that we're seeing. Are there other kind of interesting types of data that is unique to insurers that these threat actors are targeting? If anyone can add to this. Maybe Mark? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. I think one of the sort of unique things that you would find in an insurance account, and also data held by, let's say, an insurer as opposed to any other financial institution, is that, well, you wouldn't expect your bank to care very much about your blood type or your medical history, or what things you're allergic to, or your history of smoking, and all these basically constitute your identity. And identity is one of those things that once lost, you can't ever regain again, right? It's not like losing money or losing something else. And these are things that once someone has discovered your identity and your medical information, it's kind of forever out there for anyone to sort of capitalize on, right? And I think insurers uniquely have possession of this data. We trust insurers with this data because we trust them to provide us with the best possible coverage and quotes on the basis of our conditions. And that's something that I think people who sign up for insurance, would dearly hold true, and that's something that people don't really think about as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Mark. Simon, Charles, would you guys like to add to that in terms of the kind of data that these threat actors may be after? Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Vincent. And I definitely want to echo Mark's comments there. I think it's such a personal it's just beyond personal, actually. It's very confidential, right? If you think about the data that insurers hold, medical data, I mean, that's a lot of history, very rich, bit of a treasure trove. So, attackers, depending on the types of attackers as well, right? Their motivation would be very different. But if I think about the recent attacks, a large part of the attacks were driven because of monetary or economic gain. And so, having a treasure trove of not just your personal information, but, medical data makes it a lot more lucrative for, these attackers. And, you really hold that organization in hostage. Because if I take a step back, and, I'm sure, Charles, you probably echo this as well, insurance is largely driven through trust, isn't it? I mean, it's a trust-based business. So, you're really pulling at the heartstrings when you're holding the keys of someone's data, right? By taking their data away, and you're forcing that organization to go through a very difficult time, right? In terms of reputation, damage to the trust, etc. So, I think the probability of gaining a much larger win of monetary gain, I think it's very, very attractive. I mean, I think the CNA Financials, right, is a great example in the US just earlier this year, right, where they paid out about $40 million, isn't it? I mean, it's an American-based insurer, but yeah, it's a treasure trove of data that insurers hold.
And certainly what's happening there would be something that's possible to happen in Hong Kong as well, because the type of data are the same, right? Charles, do you have anything to add to this, or shall we move on to the next topic? Yes, go ahead, Charles.
I don't want to scare people that insurance carry a lot of information, and we do protect those information well as well. Let me just add to that. I think certainly a lot of medical information, very, very personal. I think payment information, I think those information, people can gain direct economic benefits from that, but I also want to comment on things that it's indirect economic benefits. For example, right, your medical history pattern, right? Which doctor have you seen? What kind of medical history you actually have, and your spending pattern as well. So those are actually very personal information as well. Another piece of information is very unique to an insurance company is actually the beneficiary information. So once you have problems, who do you want to give your wealth to? Right? Those are also very sensitive information, and also there are additional information about that beneficiary as well. So it's not just about the policyholder now. It's also additional company beyond the policyholder. So again, those are information. If you fall into interested party, it can be very powerful.
Those are some of the things I haven't considered before you brought it up. Interesting points from all the panelists. Now, Charles, while we still have you here, I think one thing that's unique about your background, most CEOs, I suppose, don't really come from a risk background. They mostly come from a business background, or they come increasingly from a technology background, but very seldom from a risk background. And I think particularly like what the other panelists are saying as well is that some insurers are not spending as much money in cybersecurity. And I think some of the struggle with that sometimes is because it's difficult to get the buy-in from the top management, right? So how do the heads of cybersecurity, the heads of risk department try to convince the business unit and also the C-levels to really invest in this technology?
No, that's an interesting question. I think as you see, cybersecurity is actually a very, very hot topic these days, both from a regulator perspective and also from a organizational perspective. This has been the focus of many organizations, right? So we are very fortunate that I think, at least for Blue here, we actually don't need any convincing. If anything, the question is about, are we actually doing enough, right? So that has been the focus, that has been the discussions, at least at our board level and also at our management level. The focus on protecting the customer first and also protecting the organization. So I think again, I think the recognition of that, I think, is very strong in the organization. From a regulatory perspective, I think you're seeing, I think in Hong Kong, the IA also issue a lot of guidelines in terms of cybersecurity as well. So I think both from a regulatory environment and also organization industry perspective, I think there has been a lot of focus on that. So it actually helped. It helped the management team to do the convincing, ask for more spending. Again, I like to emphasize that for Blue here, I think this is a very key topic for us, and there has been no need for much convincing. If anything, just do more, please.
All right, thank you for that, Charles. And Simon, you spent around 2 decades advising your clients on digital transformation, cybersecurity strategies. Is your observation the same as Charles? Do you think that there's not much struggle in getting buy-in from senior management when it comes to cybersecurity investment, or have your experience been slightly different than that?
Yeah, so no, thanks. I think it's a really good question and a timely one, Vincent. So, I like to sort of support it with some stats, right? So if I think
Sure.
about
That's great.
the survey that we run across our client base, we do that annually, and one of the key reasons why we do that is to obtain insights in terms of what our clients are thinking when it comes to cybersecurity spending, but also priorities, the governance aspect. I think the question you've touched on has got a number of factors there. I think governance is key, right? And I think to Charles' point, it's great that, as the CEO or the board, they've got a good understanding of why cybersecurity is important. And what we find through our surveys is that, our annual survey is that, I think the board gets it, right? From at least from a financial services perspective, board gets the importance of cybersecurity. The senior management do as well. Where we feel the opportunity to sort of further fine tune is for cybersecurity leaders to actually educate the board through some sort of tangible, quantifiable means in financial terms, right? So if I'm going to be spending X dollars amounts in cybersecurity, this is how it's going to translate specifically to my, to the organization's risk appetite, right? I think having that traceability is key, because if you think about the way, senior management and boards run, right, they try to run it both from a qualitative but also a quantitative manner. So I think having that clarity in the communication is very, very important. And that's where we're seeing more and more of cybersecurity leaders, be it CISOs or TISOs in this case as well, spend their time with the board, right? So I think it's pivoting. The other thing too is I think the board understands that we, at least from the conversations we're having with our clients, is that compliance is key. It's super important, but it alone isn't enough. Right. I think, you need to think about how do you move your cybersecurity program to be more focused on being resilient, right? Contributing towards the overall resilience of the organization as well. So I think weaving in those topics into the board discussions definitely will swing more favor towards cybersecurity leaders who are wanting to see the risks, but feel the need to have some additional investment.
Thank you, Simon. One of our audience who's tuning in here, who is a group CEO at one of the digital insurance, kind of digital first insurer in ASEAN, is also kind of agreeing with what you say over there in terms of education for board and regulatory. Now let's move on to Mark. And I think it seems quite universal that the panelists agree that insurers don't really have a big challenge in getting buy-in from the senior management. So Mark, if you have the same observation, then my follow-up question would be more focused on what kind of technologies should insurers be focusing on. Mark, you have the floor.
Sure. Yeah, so let me speak to not just insurance companies, but also broader financial institutions in this regard. I think the sort of challenges and technologies are quite similar. I think first up, maybe there is often a conception that cybersecurity is a sort of cost center, right? Where every dollar you spend you can measure it today. The benefits, you can't really measure it, and so spending goes down a black box, and it's a cost center for the business. And I think and the other sort of paradigm that I wanted to bring up is that most people see the sort of triangle where you see security, usability, and sort of cost, and people think that it's a zero-sum game, right? You can't sort of get better security while not compromising like usability. And I think these are some conceptions that needs to be sort of challenged and changed. And there are solutions out there that provide both, let's say, security and usability. So for example, people often use like captchas, for example, to defeat sort of automated attacks. I think the automated attacks are an important sort of focal point, because any sort of fraud at scale is likely to involve some sort of automation, because otherwise it just takes too long. You need machines and scripts to help you speed up this aspect of the attack. And so captchas, for example, are a common sort of tool to sort of defeat such automation. And they also impose a huge sort of user friction as well. Like, for example, it might not stop like a user who already has, a policy with you to log into, access his or her policy, but it might, discourage someone who potentially wanted to get a quote from you from getting a quote, because that's a very low touch thing. You can always, go to the next website for the next sort of insurer. So I think in that regard, solutions exist to, for example, not use captcha and therefore not impose that friction on the user, and to invisibly sort of identify whether or not the users come from a sort of bot environment or a bot network. Those exist, and those don't need to be extremely sort of costly as well. I think as insurance companies put more functions online, the other thing I think that's quite unique about insurance companies is that compared to a bank, right? You don't really log in to check on your insurance policy every day. You might do it like, when policy renewal comes on, or when you need like proof of insurance, or you want to file a claim, which, touch wood, doesn't happen all too often, right? Unlike a bank where you may log in, several times a week. And so this creates a sort of like weakness, like, both from a security perspective, because, you can't really remember your password anymore. The password might have been compromised in like 50 data breaches from the last time you logged in, right? And there is less of a touch point from the insurance company to you in terms of all the security messaging or good practices. Yeah. So those are things to consider, and there are sort of like solutions that help to address some of those things too.
Thank you, Mark. I think to the point that you brought up, I would be really concerned about the person who's checking his insurance policy every day. So I think you brought up a good point about cybersecurity being viewed as a cost center, and the whole triangle of usability and also security as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I think as a user, the worst usability kind of experience is having my data being available to people who's not supposed to have it, right? There's no experience worse than that. But I kind of want to talk to Charles about the whole question of cost centers, right? So
Yeah.
I think it would be an interesting paradigm shift to stop viewing security as a cost center, but as a part of business and digital transformation as a profit center. How do you view it in blue in terms of cybersecurity cost?
Well, first of all, I do agree with Mac. I think in terms of just traditionally, it did, or it was viewed as a cost center. I think that viewpoint or that perception has gradually changed. I think I give you an instance. I think I'll give you an example. I think the experience that we had in here is that I think what we have done is that we have highlighted the benefits, and we have also highlighted that this can be enhancing your customer experience, right? If you have a very good monitoring tool, seamless to the users, seamless to the customers, it can actually help a lot when it comes to user experience. Again, certain company might need to go through 10 steps to actually ensure protection for the customers. But we can actually come up with something with even better protection, but 2 steps, right? Greatly enhancing the customer experience. I will share with you, I used to work for a very big bank, a global bank in the world. I can tell you, the login process is very complicated. So complicated. And every single transactions that I do, I have to do 3 times password reentry, and it's really not very nice user experience. And what it ended up is, it pushed me away. It pushed me away, so I avoid using that bank for the services that I actually need, which is a shame. So I think highlighting those benefits and highlighting those benefits to the customers are actually very important. And we need to educate the board, and we need to educate the organization to actually recognize that. So I just want to highlight that in addition to the hard dollar saying you can prevent frauds, you can prevent a lot of bad things happening, there are also the other elements about improving the business, right? Improving the user experience. I think that perspective perhaps is a lot of people does overlook.
Yeah, I think that does require a significant shift in viewpoint, right? I mean, if you look at the way Amazon do things, they are obsessed with the number of clicks and how that obsession actually leads to better conversion. And with the digital age and digital insurers like Blue, when you enable this kind of security and this kind of seamless process to get insured, I'm sure it actually is a profit center in a way. And one of the participants are also bringing up about all this biometrics and all these logins that does not require passwords, right? And I think that's really the way to move forward. Thank you for sharing your views, Charles. Simon, do you have anything to add to this conversation about cybersecurity being viewed as a cost center? Did you see a shift happening? What are your thoughts on this?
No, absolutely. Thanks, Vincent, and definitely echo Charles and Mark's views here. I think the word or the term that this sort of refers to is actually looking at cybersecurity as a business enabler, right? Meaning to say that typically it's been all about defense, right? It's something you need to have as a checklist. And I think there's a paradigm shift definitely amongst the FSIs. What more could cybersecurity do for us, more from a business enablement perspective? So some of the examples that were being shared, the improving the customer experience. Now we work with our clients from a broader digital transformation perspective, and I think cybersecurity has the opportunity to be part of that journey by being at the very early onset, right? So if you think about organizations or insurers that are looking at, dreaming up a new and improved customer experience or customer journey, you need to bring in your cybersecurity folks in there, right? And understanding the business sort of aspirations around, improving the experience, and then having innovative ideas to drive from a security standpoint. How do you enable that vision, right? There's some of the examples, we're certainly seeing in the chat window here from the attendees is passwordless logins, right? The other thing too to understand is, you've got a whole new generation of customers that are coming in, which are very much used to speed and seamless experience, using mobile apps, etc. So I think the challenge is definitely there, but I think the important thing for boards and the business is to ensure that cybersecurity is actually being considered and embedded, in the business initiatives at the very early onset.
Yeah, I guess it's true, right? I mean, we're getting so used to everything being seamless, and then particularly, I guess for the digital natives, if they can get a date seamlessly on Tinder, it would feel very jarring then to go to an insurance website and struggle with 10-15 steps to get insured. I guess in a way we do need to catch up with that. So let's quickly move on to Mark, and I think the kind of question that I have for you, Mark, is do you see that kind of shift number one, and number two, because Simon was talking about bringing in the cybersecurity team to be part of the entire business process of coming up with digital transformation and whatnot. So that also requires the cybersecurity professionals to have a business and a transformation kind of thinking, right? So number one, are you observing that shift from risk to profit center? Number two, are you observing cybersecurity professionals increasingly putting on a more business kind of hat in your experience in dealing with your clients?
Sure. So I think let me just tackle the second point first in terms of cybersecurity sort of transitioning from a cost center to being viewed as a business enabler. I think this is very slowly happening. I think not fast enough for the vast majority of businesses. And I started really tracking this when I worked in Singapore's cybersecurity agency many years ago. And what we observed then was that then at that point the term cybersecurity itself was new, right? So a lot of thoughts were kind of like forming and norming around it. Now it's a little bit better. I think there are certain industries, especially sort of newer, smaller, more nimbler startups that have adopted this approach of seeing cybersecurity as something more integral to the sort of business that they have and the sort of features that they offer their users. But I think the challenge that all organizations face, right, not just insurers, not just FIs or fintech companies, is that people don't usually have the luxury from starting from scratch. Like if you were to start from scratch today, obviously there is no question of imposing the latest and greatest cybersecurity requirements. But in fact, most insurers, most companies would inherit legacy systems, with their own outdated requirements. Recently, I was talking to a client, and the sad thing was that they were having a lot of latency issues in their systems, and that was because a lot of their backend systems were mainframe systems, like huge machines from like decades ago. So obviously, getting data, don't even talk about API, just getting data available is a challenge. But I think also to point out to the fact that organizationally, moving from security, to profit center is maybe a bit of a stretch. And what I've seen some companies successfully do is instead of moving it all the way to the right, like kind of seeing how security can be integrated with fraud teams, with risk teams. I think that sort of integrated approach has proven successful. So oftentimes we see customers where, even large companies where the security team sits on one end, right, and works in quite a silo, and the fraud team sits on the other end. And oftentimes, we, Shape FI, find ourselves being the intermediary because we see data from both sides. And so we're able to say, hey, we can pass you this data that, your colleagues from, the security team have been using. And we kind of can educate the security team that, it's not actually IP addresses and, networks that matter so much. It's like, usernames and passwords, and can you also process that and use that to leverage, to identify security issues and fraud issues. So those are some interesting points.
Thanks, Mark. There is a comment from the audience talking about legacy systems, and I think you kind of addressed that a bit. I do want to pass the question on to Charles in a bit, but before that, since you brought up the topic of data, and I think your title is interesting, right? Because it's not often you see a director of data science focused specifically on cybersecurity. It's a very specific and unique skill set, right? And I was wondering, like, for people who may not be so familiar with the use of data and how data is utilized for the purpose of cybersecurity, what is it like being in your role, and how does that help your clients to better protect their users?
I think data is quite integral to this whole business of cybersecurity because as much as we can preach, hey, these are the recommendations, it's often much more helpful when we go to customers and say, hey, we have been looking at our data, we have been collecting our data, and here, this is the read back of what the situation looks like. These are the exact threats that you see, and this is how, therefore, we recommend that you kind of address them. It's a much more data-driven approach. It's much harder to argue with data. Like, it's easier to avoid, cognitive biases and stuff when you have the hard sort of numbers in front of you. And basically, you can, more easily assess the scale of the problem. Not every company has a, automation, a bot problem, for example, right? But you need the data to kind of show you whether you have that. And the thing is that, a sort of data-driven approach from fraud, from security, from risk is always, I would say, helpful. it's also easier to convince management that say, hey, we have a cybersecurity issue, right? These are the numbers, and therefore you should give us, more budget and more spending to put in better cybersecurity measures. Yeah. And when a breach inevitably happens, then you know what has been breached and the scale of the breach, and you can better communicate that to customers. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Speaking of breach, that's a question I probably want to get to later, but let's move on to Charles. Charles, earlier in the conversation during the introduction, you talked about legacy systems and how it's a little bit of a challenge for insurers. Now, naturally, of course, with Blue, you don't really have that much of an issue with legacy systems compared to maybe your time in Aviva, but maybe you could give us a sense of how insurers can overcome this whole issue of legacy systems to better protect their users. Maybe you can give us some insights on that. Charles, you have the floor.
Well, that's a very difficult question indeed. First of all, let me just comment a little bit about why legacy systems potentially have more problems than kind of the newer systems, right? I will come from two different angles. One is from a technology perspective. I think as an example, I think many insurance systems are actually not cloudable. Not cloudable, making yourself very limited to having a greater capability for flexibilities, and also leave it to the expert to help protecting you, right? One of the benefits of having the cloud services is potentially having a larger organization with the experts monitoring your system and helping you to protect the organization. So legacy system very often are not cloudable. That as an example from a technology perspective. The second perspective is about knowledge, right? Legacy systems, again, I don't want to name the name of the system, but COBOL-based, even older than COBOL-based. These days, you're still seeing these hundreds of people maintaining those, and where are you going to find those knowledge, right? When you have a problem, how are you going to fix it? And when you have a normal problem, a small problem, that's okay, because you probably have a decent team to help protecting you. But when you have a deeper problem, I think that how do you actually fix it? How do you actually help constantly improving the cybersecurity? Not to mention, I think today the cybersecurity is actually very, very complex, right? The cyber issues are very complex issues. It's evolutionary. It's constantly changing. It's not just fixed in the stone. Once you do this patch, you're all done. I'm all well protected. It's not the case. So therefore, how do you actually keep improving the system, keep the knowledge, keep going? That's extremely difficult. Legacy system does have those problems.
That's really insightful. Thanks for sharing your views on this area. I kind of want to move on to talk about the breaches, but before I do that, Simon, do you have anything to add to the conversation about legacy systems?
No, I think totally spot on, from both Mark and Charles. I think the legacy systems, they have a lot of history. It's difficult. We do a lot of work from an EY perspective with customers who are looking to transform, right, move from the old to the new, and just try to unravel the spaghetti of historical work that has been done on the legacy systems, plus the technology debt, right? You're better off probably getting something entirely new and then starting from scratch in some cases. So I think the fact that the legacy systems are there, from a cybersecurity perspective as well, if you look at the technology landscape, right, in terms of the tools that are coming out, they're sort of geared towards the new, right, because there's more and more of the move to the new. So there is potentially a risk of having high costs in continuously high cost in maintaining your legacy infrastructure or your legacy systems, and that doesn't help the challenge that is already there from a cybersecurity spending perspective. So I think these are some of the potential considerations that needs to be made as well.
Thank you, Simon. Now, moving on to the next question. As Mark has pointed out earlier, as much as we do our level best to protect the users, sometimes breach do inevitably happen, right? So from your viewpoint in EY, when this does happen to maybe one of your clients or whatnot, how would you advise them, number one, in terms of ramping up to prevent this from happening, and number two, how do you regain the trust of the users? Because as many of the panelists have pointed out, insurance is a trust business, right? Simon, what are your views on this?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And, it's a very nervous one as well, right? In fact, I think if I think about, the data breach, if it happens, I think the first important thing is that to understand is that restoring reputation and customer trust is a long-term project, right? Particularly for the insurance sector. And so I think, the part of the steps should involve informing, right, your customers and users that you are committed as an organization to quickly contain the impact, right, mitigate the risks, and also share about what you're going to be doing to prevent a reoccurrence, right? And so what I think that transparency, that effective communication is important, because it actually drives confidence and trust back into the user community. I feel that trying to sort of do a cover up doesn't help, because if you try to do a cover up, it actually, significantly impacts even further, right? When the cat is out of the bag, if you may. So I think having that approach from a communication perspective, I think it's very, very important. And I think from a preventative perspective, I think prevention is very, very hard to achieve, to be very frank. It's a board level conversation, that I've had, we as a firm have constantly. So I think the focus has to be, as an organization, is to double down on your response and your containment strategies, right? Have very clear definition of how do you want to, manage that and execute your incident response plan. Who are the key decision makers? Where do you really call out some of the decision points in the process, etc., and have very strong partnerships, right? And run tabletop exercises, because I think those tends to drive a lot of actually even expose certain things that you thought you had, but end up you don't really have it, right? So I think having that sort of periodic simulations are important as well.
Thank you, Simon. And I think the point about not covering up is an important one, right? Because there's always a lot of cybersecurity experts in forums who are eager to lift the will on the cover up, and media is always quick to catch up on those things. So it often backfires. Let's move on to Mark. And I think, Mark, you're able to offer very unique perspectives given your previous background in the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, right? So I think maybe you can share with us what steps insurers should take should a breach occur. Go ahead and unmute your mic, Mark.
For sure. Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of what Simon has said. I think in terms of being open and transparent, that's always a good strategy, because the media would always kind of like pick you up, and some forum users would always kind of pick you up as to if you're not totally transparent and people find out that the truth is otherwise. I think companies, insurers would be in much worse shape. So timeliness, being transparent, like nobody expects anybody to know like everything, right? Including the root cause of an incident the moment a breach occurs, right? It's just not reasonable, not practical. I think people are understanding of that. But what people are not understanding of is, hey, if they try to figure out if any data has been breached, if any data has been lost, is their account still safe, and they don't get the answers and responses that they need, I think that is sort of frustrating too as an end user, and certainly for the media who would certainly try to sort of amplify that. I think the most successful sort of responses to incidents that we've seen, sort of I've seen in my career, are those that are extremely timely, honest, candid, don't skimp on detail, don't think ever that users are not savvy enough to understand some of the technicalities, and therefore, broad brush over those, those details, that never works in your favor. Like always, provide a good sort of summary of, what actually happened, and for those who are technically inclined, like, they can kind of explore further as well. I think, yeah, that's basically the strategy that I would offer.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? You have one that's geared towards the technical people, and then you have one that's geared towards a general consumer to provide everyone a full picture of what happened. Thanks for your insights, Mark. Charles, over at Blue, what is your response plan if there was a breach, and how would you then take steps to regain the trust of the users should something like this occur? Charles, you have the floor.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to echo the comments that's given. I think trust comes from transparency, right? And I think it's absolutely critical that I think when that happens, you share the impact. But one thing I thought was really important is timeliness of the information, right? Sometimes you might not have the full picture, and sometimes you probably don't even know what's going on yet. But I think the timely information, keeping the customer informed, is super important. And also sometimes not just give them the good news, but give them the bad news as well, right? So being completely transparent is absolutely crucial for me, right? But the two other points I want to add to that is one is about commitment, two is about ability. The commitment to address the issue and the ability to address the issue, you need to demonstrate that, because crap happened, and then what, right? So the ability to demonstrate that to the customer, I think is crucial. Again, I think people probably have read from a lot of the case studies. I think if you keep your customer informed along the whole journey, your customer tend to be a lot more forgiving, right? Even though they know the data has been stolen, for example, they tend to be a lot more forgiving, because I think we're all human beings. We know that crap happens sometimes, and nobody can always say that they're 100% bulletproof, right? So I thought that's very crucial. In terms of what do we need to do? I think, well, first of all, I think all players or all industry players need to have a framework and a strategies in place to react to cybersecurity incidents. I think, again, we talk about technology, we talk about protection, we talk about a lot of those stuff. I think those are things that must be done. But at the same time, having a plan, having a strategies, having a framework to react or to protect or to respond is also very, very crucial. And also my answer to some of those are actually very simple, right? Go to the experts. I'm sure Mark and Simon would love to hear that. Right? Go to the expert for help. I think sometimes we don't carry all the knowledge, right? We cannot always claim ourselves as specialists in all areas. So for me, right, having those frameworks in place, go to the experts for help as needed.
Good point. The whole idea of going to the experts is the whole reason why Mark and Simon has a job in the first place, right? That's the entire business model. All right, we've unfortunately run short on time. So maybe Charles, I'd like to invite you to share your closing thoughts with the audience. Any advice to other insurer brethren out there before we close the session, Charles?
Sure. Well, I think we need to recognize that cyber risk, as its nature, is really complex, and many organizations are struggling to identify the right countermeasure. And I would say that I think there are multiple areas that we all need to look at. I think additional to technology certainly is very, very important. Invest in the right technology, very, very important. Secondly, I would say test yourself. Test your capabilities, right? Make sure that you are watertight. I think sometimes it's really hard to understand where you stand without giving a hard test to yourself. So testing yourself is crucial. I also talk about having a framework in place, having a strategies in place. both in terms of protections and also detection and also reacting to an incident. I think that's crucial as well. And the two other points I want to highlight, I think, which we often have forgotten. You can have a very, very secure house, but if somebody from the inside open the door, no matter how secure your door is actually worthless. So educating your people, educating customer, training them well, keeping them informed about some of these likely examples actually is a very important part of the overall framework. So I would like to highlight that point. And lastly, ask the expert and go to the expert for help as needed.
Thank you for that very salient and important points, Charles. Let's move on to Simon for some closing thoughts and advice. Simon, you have the floor.
Well, thanks, Vincent. No, I think we'll leave one thought. Work. I think this is a coalition effort, right? So form coalitions within the industry sectors. The bad guys are going to continue to be the bad guys, and I think as we share insights and information with each other as industry players, when you go to a playground, right, and you've got one bully, but if you have a group of people together, right, the bully steps back, isn't it? So I think it's a very simple principle. Within the FS industry, we do see, for example, in the banking sector, they have a group called TrueSight, right, where they formed a coalition together to combat third-party security risks. So I think that model works in a lot of sense, and I think it's a similar model that we should be as practitioners. Cybersecurity practitioners in the industry to work together closely, share ideas, exchange, etc. And I think that will help the ecosystem ultimately.
Thank you for that, Simon. And yeah, the whole coalition and collaboration is a good point, right? Because the age-old wisdom is that if one insurer gets attacked, the trust for the entire industry goes down, and nobody wants that. Thanks for your views, Simon. Mark, what are your closing thoughts and advice for our audience tuning in today?
Yeah. I wanted to add on to what Simon said on closing, that today information sharing doesn't have to be like fully manual. Like I think it could be automated. There could be better sort of sharing by design, like within the industry. Whether it's through leveraging networks or vendors who, for example, see multiple customers in the industry. I think that's important. I think the last thing I want to bring up is that no breach or no attack happens without any sort of like warning or signals. Like, in all of the incidents I've ever seen, if you look hard enough, there is always a signal. People always need to do reconnaissance. People always need to test waters first before launching a full-scale attack. And having good monitoring and sort of detection capabilities, I think, are key. And it's possible to do that with technology without having to hire a whole bunch of people staffing, a security operations center. And that's, something I would like to leave the audience.
Thank you. And those are some important points to live on. With that, leaves me the pleasure to thank everybody for tuning in and all the speakers for sharing these really important insights with us today. I certainly learned a lot and hope the rest of you did too. So yeah, thanks and have a great rest of the day. Take care now. Bye-bye.